skies will be filled with the greatest air armada the world has ever seen. Our own Army Air Forces, the best planes ever built, 65,000 planes this year. By the time you finish your training, America will have overwhelming superiority in the air.
Okay, good morning, and thank you very much for showing up. Appreciate it, and we're going to talk today about aircraft carriers. This is an aviation museum, but the ships, aircraft carriers, are an integral part of an aviation system, which includes the planes, of which we have a fair number, but also the ships. Obviously, we're here in Colorado Springs, so we don't have the opportunity to bring ourselves an aircraft carrier here, but it's important when you go and especially look at the carrier-based planes that we have in our collection that you understand how they operate. Happy St. Patrick's Day. It's actually tomorrow, but please, I'm an Irishman, and it's a pretty important day for me, so thank you again for coming. Why are we talking about these? Why are we talking about the ships? Well, carrier aviation was very important in both theaters of the war. There is an integral link between the planes, of which we have in our collection, and the ships themselves. But there is also a difficulty by a lot of landlubbers to understand a lot of the terminology. And we in the Navy kind of go out of our way to make things particularly confusing. So we're going to try to work around some of those. We're going to talk about who the ships are, their names, how they came to be named that, where they're located, what they did in the war, etc. Then we're going to talk about what, the anatomy of the ship, because again, it uses a lot of terminology. And aircraft carriers are very, very different than almost any other ship. And then we're going to talk about the how, the operations, both of the ship as well as the planes that are on our collection and how they operated. Why are the aircraft carriers and why is carrier-based aviation very important in World War II? Because there was a whole series of battles that occurred during the war. The British Navy had aircraft carriers and used them very, very expertly. The Battle of Taranto in the Mediterranean, the heel of the Italian boot, which destroyed the Italian fleet, was extremely important. The Imperial Japanese Navy utilized their aircraft carriers very expertly, and I just need to start something. Very expertly and to great impact. The Battle of Midway, again, a carrier-based battle. The entire Battle of the Atlantic that we talked about last year. And finally, the Pacific Theater was nothing more than a succession of carrier-based battles, but also amphibious warfare that was supported primarily by aircraft carriers. So important to the overall World War II history. Talk about aircraft carriers. There was a lot of them around. We in the United States had about 24 of the full fleet aircraft carriers, but also had light aircraft carriers and escort carriers, etc. Our friends in the Royal Navy used aircraft carriers very expertly and did a lot of the advanced technology development that we in the United States Navy benefited from. The Imperial Japanese Navy had and employed very expertly their aircraft carriers and their carrier-based aviation. They didn't have the sort of development because they didn't have the arsenal of democracy that we had operating here in the United States. And finally, actually the Kriegsmarine, I think, had an aircraft carrier, but it was not used particularly much. But there were a lot of them, and they were very important. There is a link between the ships and the planes, and we're going to talk about that, and then this difficulty of understanding some of the terminology. A lot of people read books, watch movies, etc., and they come to me mistakenly and ask questions about things Navy, because we use a lot of terminology, and sometimes ships are hard to understand. And I'm going to try to help us navigate that a little bit. This is a picture that has actually showed up on our website. And it's of a Dauntless, and it is on one of the earlier aircraft carriers. And it shows how important carrier-based aviation was. So one of the first questions that people ask me is, aircraft carriers, are they ships or are they boats? And are there sailors in the audience? We'll probably know what they think the answer is, but it depends on who you ask. So in the carrier-based community, there are generally two classes of people on board. One of the, what we call the squids, the sailors, sometimes referred to as the Black Shoe Navy because the officers wear black shoes, and they adamantly defend the terminology, it is a ship, and don't call it anything else. The Airedales, on the other hand, which includes all the aviation community, enlisted and officer, love to call them boats, simply to drive the squiddies crazy. But aircraft carriers are ships, but when you hear aviators talk about the ship, they will talk about returning to the boat, and where is the boat going to be when I come back? So this ship-boat thing is something that has been going on for at least 80 years, and I see no end in sight. There is the issue of the ship's company, and those generally are the people who are responsible for making sure the ship gets from point A to point B, and then the air wing, which includes not only the pilots, but an air crew, but also all the mechanics and all sometimes the administrative people that support squadron and aviation operations. The actual operation of catapults and arresting gear and moving ships around are actually done by the ship's company, but aviation personnel assigned to the ship. There is some confusion over who's in charge, because there will be the commanding officer of the ship, but there will be also the commander of the air group responsible for making sure the planes get where they're supposed to be. And often, but not all the time, often the admiral who is in charge of the entire task force will be riding as a passenger on the aircraft carrier along with his staff. So if you're simply looking at the number of people with eagles and stars on their shoulders trying to figure out who's in charge, it's again a bit more complicated. The CO of the ship is responsible for the ship's company, moving the ship around. The commander of the air group is responsible for aviation operations. And the admiral and his staff is basically in charge of the big picture and really are just nothing more than passengers on board. One of the things that comes up is the terminology. So for instance, I was a volunteer in South Carolina at Patriots Point, which is in Charleston, South Carolina, and we had the USS, the United States ship, Yorktown, which was CV, which is the Navy's designation for an aircraft carrier, 10. And it was often people would come on board and said, I've just finished this book about the Pacific, and I thought the Yorktown was sunk. And they would be right, because the USS Yorktown CV-5, its predecessor, had been sunk and was laying on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. So we in the Navy were very environmentally conscious, so we recycled ship names. And we did it to confuse the enemy, which we did fairly aggressively, but we also did it to honor the people who lost their lives on the loss of the first ship. So you'll hear of ships being commissioned. Not so much now. Most of our new aircraft carriers are using some new names, but we do have a ship coming up which will be called the Enterprise, which has a long history. The USS refers to a United States ship. You may be, if you're, geez, there was a ship and it was an oiler or it was a hospital ship, and it was called a USNS, a United States naval ship. So it's a different designation, is not a commissioned ship of the Navy, sometimes has civilian crews, sometimes will have members of the US Navy aboard. But they're also, if you're reading books, you'll hear about HMS, His Majesty's ship, a British ship, His Majesty's Canadian or Australian or New Zealand ship. The Kriegsmarine will be the same three-letter designator that will be in front of a German, the Reich ships. The Imperial Japanese Navy is His Majesty's Imperial Japanese ship. So there'll be those designations. The names are all over the place. We in the US sometimes think we have a convention, but it's only proved by the exceptions to it. And then finally we tell you what the designation of the ship is. So BBs are battleships. CVs are aircraft carriers. And that's a particularly troublesome one because no one really has a very perfect idea of where the letters CV came from. Most of the early carriers were developed from existing hulls that were cruisers. So most of them, people think that the C in the CV came from the cruiser designation, and they're probably right. The V is much more problematic because some people think it has its origin in the French word to fly, voler, and they're probably right, but no one has a better explanation. And then the number is simply a sequential number that designates the number of aircraft carriers. CV1 was the Langley, which date back to the 20, and I think we're into the 70s right now in terms of our designations for CVs. So if you're reading things, you'll see a lot of different designations of ships, BBs for battleships, etc. And don't get confused by them. In aircraft carriers, we sometimes refer to them as CVAs, attack aircraft carriers. Our new nuclear-powered aircraft carriers are generally designated CVNs. During the Cold War, we used a lot of anti-submarine warfare aircraft carriers, and they were CVSs. Way much more information than you'd want. But the issue is we will have very frequently in World War II two ships with the same name, one that it doesn't exist anymore because it's been sunk, and one of them that is commissioned. So I was a volunteer on board in Patriots Point on CV-10, the USS Yorktown, but the other Yorktown CV-5 was on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean somewhere near Midway Island. I don't know if you can read a lot of that, but the yellow highlighted ship names are examples of these two ships with the same number. So the first is CV2, the Lexington, which was sunk at Coral Sea, and we had CV16 that was being built, and that was renamed to be the Lexington. So the Lexington, the Yorktown, the Wasp, and the Hornet all were ships that were sunk early in the war, and some of the Essex-class aircraft carriers that were in construction were renamed for them. We had a small group of ships called light aircraft carriers that were converted light cruisers. One of the most important ones, I think, was the San Jacinto, because the 41st President of the United States, George Herbert Walker Bush, was flying off the San Jacinto when he crashed and nearly lost his life. And then there's a whole group of escort carriers that we'll talk about very, very briefly. There were a bunch of escort carriers. They were very important to the war. I'm not going to talk about them very much, but they were essentially half the size of the attack carriers, the Essex-class carriers, but they did Herculean work in terms of anti-submarine warfare, transporting aircraft around, and supporting amphibious operations. The escort carriers is probably the subject of a whole nother presentation. This is a World War II aircraft carrier. This is the Essex class. We call them the Essex class because the first ship of this design was called the USS Essex. And most of the Essex class are almost identical to it, and we call that the class of ships. So I served aboard the Bonhomme Richard. Was that an Essex class carrier? Yes, it was. Because there was 24 built. It cost about $75 million, and we were cranking them out in about 15 months from numerous shipyards, mostly on the East Coast of the United States. These are the escort carriers. This cost about $4 million, a lot cheaper. Crank them out in about 12 months, and we built a whole bunch of them, about 122, of which about a third of them went to the Royal Navy, and they used them very effectively in the Battle of the Atlantic and other portions of World War II. Let's talk about the anatomy of the ship. What does it consist of, and some of the terminology. I got to tell you a little secret. Aircraft carriers are very important to the war, but boy, they're ugly looking ships. You got a big superstructure that's way off on one side, so it looks like the ship should fall over at some time, and they are not a particularly pretty looking ship. When you take a look at some of the Bismarck, for instance, the German ship, you take a look at the Iowa, Missouri, the New Jersey, those are pretty looking ships. And I got to say, as much as I am a fan of aircraft carriers and naval aviation, aircraft carriers aren't pretty looking ships. We're going to talk about several features: the island, the flight deck, the elevators, the hangar deck, and then a little bit about the engineering spaces, because I'm an engineer and I like to talk about those things. That's a privilege I get. So let's talk about the island. If it was up to the naval aviators, we wouldn't have an island, because they just want a flat deck with nothing in the way to bump into. It's reasonable. But the ship drivers, the Black Shoe Navy, the squiddies, they need to have a place to stand and drive the boat. And if you're going to drive the boat, you better be able to see where you're going. So there was a back and forth in the early development of aircraft carriers, both by the Japanese, the British, and ourselves, to try to figure out how we accommodate those two conflicting desires. The aviators to have a clean slate so they don't bump into anything, and the squiddies, the sailors, to understand how they're going to drive the ship. And the final solution was to put the island over to the side of the runway, of the flight deck. And on US ships, they're all on the starboard side. Okay, so that's the right side of the ship as it's moving forward. I know it's hard for the Army people, but just keep on coming with me. Okay, so they're all on the starboard side. Our friends in the Imperial Japanese Navy actually had some on the starboard side and some on the port side, because they operated their carriers closer together, and the flight paths would interfere with each other if they were all on the starboard side. We just generally did not operate our carriers that way. So it does create an asymmetry in terms of the balance of the ship, and you'll find out that sometimes there's big hunks of concrete put into some of the voids low in the ship to keep it from tipping over to one side. The island is important because it's where the people drive the ship. It's a nice high spot to put all the antenna. And in World War II, as we progress and electronics start to be a big deal, radar, radios, and so forth, this antenna array on top of the island becomes very important. But it is still an object of some concern to the aviators, because sometimes they can't really control their airplanes. And the reason that the U.S. put our islands on the right side is that when you're flying in some of these big, powerful airplanes, like our Corsair in our collection, and you're not going to be able to land. You messed it up, and you have to go around. As you put the power in, the plane has a tendency to pull to the left. Okay, it's the natural sort of impact of several forces on the airplane, some of which include the torque of the propeller. So if the island would be on the left side of the ship, you could bang into it, and that probably would not be a good thing. So because of the left turning tendency on airplanes, especially on go-arounds, we found it safer to put the island on the starboard side. Stuff makes sense. This is the island of the Yorktown at Patriots Point. This is the navigation bridge. I'm sorry, this is the navigation bridge where the captain, that's his office, as well as the people who steer the ship and get it to go where it needs to go. Usually below that is the staff bridge. So this is where, if the admiral and the staff is on board, we put them down here. And the difference between the conning bridge, commanding the ship, and the staff bridge is we don't give the admiral a steering wheel. And that's a really good idea. We also don't give him a throttle. So all he can do, we give him a compass, we give him a radar repeater, stuff like that, but we don't give him anything that he'd hurt himself with. So that's what, and then there is another bridge aft, and this is called PRI-FLY, or primary flight control. So this is where the commander of the air group and his people who manage the airplanes on the deck have their house up on there. One of the major functions of the island is to take the exhaust gases from the boilers and bring them up onto the stack and get them out of the way. Early development in aircraft carriers, what to do with exhaust gas was a big deal. And finally, this turned out to be the best way to get the exhaust gas high and away from the flight deck. These two areas are known as Vulture's Row. So one of the few forms of amusement on board the ship, especially for the squiddies, is to go up onto the Vulture's Row and watch the aviators screw up. It was not really a kind thing to do, but it was a pretty distinct form of recreation for our friends on board the aircraft carriers. Here you see an Essex-class carrier. This, in the early days, we put a fair number of 5-inch guns. These aren't huge guns by battleship standards, but they were a decent size. But we found out that from anti-aircraft purposes, more self-defense of the ship, that we were much better with many more smaller caliber, smaller bore anti-aircraft guns like 40 millimeters. So later on, as these ships are being modified, we find a lot of the 5 inches being removed and being replaced by 20 millimeter, but more importantly, 40 millimeter anti-aircraft guns that would be placed all along the edges of the flight deck. It's a good idea of how crowded an aircraft carrier deck would be. This is May of '43. This is the Essex. And a couple of quiz questions. People who know our airplanes, can you identify these airplanes? They're sitting on the deck with the wings all nice and stuck out. So they're not folded up. So consequently, those are the Dauntlesses. So those are our scouting airplanes and our dive bombing airplanes. And these are some agglomeration of the fighters with folded wings and some of our torpedo planes. But you can see, you pull all those airplanes on the deck, there isn't much deck left to take off from. And in philosophy at that time, or the tactics at that time, was to launch as many airplanes as you could early in and saturate the enemy's defenses. So this was not an unusual look for the deck of an aircraft carrier in May of 1943. Next feature of the ship after the flight deck, after the island, is the flight deck. So this is a view of CV-12. What's CV-12? Somebody help me out. Lexington, I think. CV-12 is the Hornet, actually. And, or no, it's 21, I'm sorry. And gives you an idea of what it looks like to be coming down and landing an airplane. So this is getting pretty close to the airplane, and you're pretty low. But does that really what the pilot sees? He's been flying an oval-shaped pattern and is coming in for his landing on the flight deck. Oh, darn it! If it's not here, it may be on later on. But the point is, that's not what the pilot sees, because he has a nose-high attitude, which we'll talk about later on. And if he looks forward, he sees his instrument panel, and all he can see of and that instrument panel basically is on a curve like this, so the pilot can't see much of the deck that he's landing on. So he needs to look out here to the landing signal officer, who will give him some direction. We'll talk about the LSOs later on. Talk about the flight deck. U.S. flight decks were made out of wood. We did that because If you add a lot of weight to a ship and add it high on the ship, and as the ship rolls, that extra weight is going to exacerbate the roll. So to make our flight decks light, we made them out of wood. There was a steel frame, and we were using teak pre-World War II. But most of that teak came from Indonesia, and on December of 1941, as the Imperial Japanese Navy was taking Pearl Harbor, they were also taking Indonesia and a lot of other sources of teak. So the Essex-class carriers used Douglas fir, and this is an example of what happens when an airplane's propeller digs into that wooden deck. It kind of messes things up. But the wood is very easy the damaged wood is very easy to cut out and remove and repair, whereas a steel deck will also be damaged, but it'll take a lot longer because it needs to be cut out with acetylene torches. So if you go on some of our museums, you'll find out the decks are replaced with steel because those wooden decks are the roof of the hangar deck and they leak like a sieve. But they were relatively easy to repair, and this shows some sailors digging up and removing some of the damaged deck. Leads us in discussion of the hangar deck. The hangar deck essentially runs from bow to stern and from starboard to port. It's a big, big open space, and it's where the work of the aviation squadrons get done. So we do repair of airplanes and maintenance of airplanes. We also store some airplanes. So a squadron consists nominally of 16 airplanes. Most squadrons came on board with 18, so they had 2 extra airplanes that they used for spare parts. They didn't take up a lot of deck space by just leaving them parked in the corner as hangar queens, but we would hang them from the ceiling, and we would also transport them sometimes from point A to point B. Pretty indication. This is a very untypical look of a hangar deck because it's all opened. Usually this is very, very cluttered with airplanes and people and equipment, etc. The hangar deck was the first main structural deck of the ship. So the deck of the hangar deck was pretty strong structural steel because it provided the top beam, the top flange of essentially a beam. And this is an interesting picture of a hangar deck. It's fairly far forward looking aft, I think, but this is a damage control point. So if a fire would start here, there were 2 big doors, one here and one further forward, I think, that could be closed, and you could isolate the hangar deck and keep the fire located in one place and fight the fire from there. U.S. aircraft carriers had an interesting feature that a lot of people don't appreciate. The hangar deck was essentially opened to the outside. These were nothing more than garage roller doors. So the planes would be started up, the engines would be run and tested on the hangar deck, and that exhaust needed to be able to be cleared out of the hangar deck. So a lot of these openings were nothing more than roll-up doors. And in the South Pacific, they were usually up because we were trying to cool off the hangar deck. This is a picture, I think, of the Yorktowns. This is their side elevator that is up here, so their edge elevator that comes down, and it was an easy way to move ships from the hangar deck to the flight deck. So we're talking about the elevators. We need to get ways to get planes up. The Essex-class carriers had mid-deck elevators. So while you're moving airplanes up and down on the elevator, you really can't use the flight deck for anything else because there's these big holes in them. They were hydraulically powered by cables on shivs and had a fairly fast cycle time. So about a minute to load a plane onto the elevator, about a minute for it to cycle down to the hangar deck, about a minute to get the plane off, another minute to get the other plane on, another minute cycled back up onto the deck, and move it off. So they could move airplanes around on the hangar deck and flight deck pretty quickly. The Essex class had one side edge elevator, and it was very effective. Here it is showed in the stowed position because these ships were designed and could move through the Panama Canal. So they were built on the Atlantic coast, and they didn't have to go all the way around South America to go to the Pacific, but they had to fold up that elevator in order to clear the structures at the Panama Canal. So there's a picture of that. This was a type of rudimentary elevator that was used in some of the pre-Essex class. There was more of a framework as opposed to a platform, but gave us the idea of using deck edge elevators. The hangar deck was a busy place. It's where the people, the machinist mates, aviation machinist mates, and some of the aviation ordnance people worked on the airplanes and the radios and other sorts of things. But it is also, we'd go and watch a movie. So it was one of the few open spaces on the aircraft carrier. We had a chapel, but sometimes because of Christmas or Easter, we would sometimes use the hangar deck for religious services when a lot of people would show up for the religious services. One thing that is kind of freaky is we had one catapult. Remember, sometimes the planes could take off because there was enough wind across the deck, so they didn't need it to be catapult. We would have catapults on the flight deck, but when the Essex were built, they had one cross-deck catapult on the hangar deck. And the idea was when all of those planes would be bunched up and ready for operation like we saw in the previous slide, you could send a scout plane out to look for the enemy by launching them through the hangar deck on this catapult. Lore has it that the pilot who would be selected to do this would always be the youngest, most inexperienced, dumbest pilot you could find. And no one would ever do it twice. By this time, usually there is a scream that is louder than the engine noise, and it is coming from the pilot. They didn't use them very long. One of the first, not total overhauls, but one of the workarounds was to remove those catapults because they were a lump on the flight deck and kind of interfered with movement of airplanes, and no one used them, and except for Mickey, let Mickey do it, except for Mickey, nobody really wanted to do this. But it makes for a great picture. Let's talk a little bit about aircraft operations. First thing is aircraft carriers never operated alone. They always operated as part of a task force, and they did that not only to project force, but also for self-protection. And it was self-protection in depth. So this is kind of a poor slide, but it shows the aircraft carrier in the center of concentric circles of larger and then smaller ships that were protecting the vulnerable aircraft carrier from the enemy. So the picket ships that would be on the farthest ring out, which typically would be about 20 miles, just about over the horizon from the center of the concentric circle, would have missions of anti-submarine warfare missions and anti-aircraft missions. So they would use sonar and radar to detect the enemy, provide some fire to divert them, but mostly the diversion would be in the larger ships of the second ring and then the airplanes that were flying the combat air patrol over the entire task force. So when you hear about usually the task force was given a number, some sort of sequential number, but it was also named after the lead aircraft carrier. And sometimes there'd be more than one aircraft carrier as each of these task forces. So they would be the Essex Task Force. And so the ships that would be part of that would be very defensive in nature, and they would be small ships, mostly destroyers, some destroyer escorts. Couple operational elements that evolved during World War II that were very important was the use of the Combat Information Center, underway replenishment, and damage control. We'll talk about each of them. Before about 1942, We didn't have, we had limited amounts of sensors, radar, sonar. We didn't have much of that. We relied on lookouts on board the ship and on ships in these concentric rings to send us information, not by radio, because the enemy could hear us on that, but usually by some other visual signals. And that would come directly to the bridge of the ship and to the captain. But as we developed radar and sonar, we started getting so much information going to the bridge that the captain and the conning crew on the bridge were being saturated. They were being overwhelmed with information. So we set up the Combat Information Center where all of that information would come in, would be filtered, and then forwarded on to the bridge. And it was a huge improvement. Our adversaries in the Imperial Japanese Navy did not do it, and there is some wonderful write-ups that show examples of the captain and the conning crew of their ships being saturated by way, way too much information. And the Combat Information Center was a real boom to the effectiveness of our defensive forces. Replenishment at sea was a big issue specifically in terms of the Pacific, because the distances were so far. So it was an attempt to bring fuel, provisions, food, replacement parts, and people to the aircraft carrier while it was at sea in the theater. So they didn't have to go back to Pearl Harbor. They didn't have to go back to Midway or other places to get fixed up and repaired and fuel. And the interesting thing about underway replenishment, or as we say in the Navy, UNREP, was that it was developed and developed and perfected in the 1920s by the staff on board a Navy oiler, the Maumee. And the lead officer was a young lieutenant commander by the name of Chester Nimitz. And when Chester showed up as the commander of Pacific Forces, he took UNREP that he had learned about on the Maumee and integrated it into Pacific operations and became very effective. Here is just a quick diagram of the fueling system from a delivery ship to a receiving ship, and taking the bunker C, which the fuel oil we used, and transferring it over to a receiving ship while underway. Other systems had been taking hoses and floating them out from bow to stern, and those things didn't work. But this was a system that Chester Nimitz, as a younger lieutenant commander, had developed and perfected and integrated into Pacific operations very effectively. If you've ever been aboard a ship during UNREP, it can get kind of scary. Because even though we don't have a lot of seas, you have two big ships operating pretty close to each other and a lot of activity going on. The heavy fuel oil we transferred was essentially asphalt and had to be treated, it had to be heated to about 120 degrees in order to pump it, so it was hot, and it was a dangerous thing to do. We also moved people back and forth. Nowadays we use helicopters to do this. It's not my favorite means of transportation. Sorry, Joe, appreciate that. But it was not the sort of thing that you'd volunteer to do. But some people on the staff, for instance, chaplains and so forth, might be on board one ship, and then come Sunday or whenever the services were, they would be transferred from one ship to the other. And I guess it was a very scary thing to do. Damage control was a huge issue with the United States Navy. We found out in the 20s and 30s that you needed to have a dedicated damage control philosophy in terms of the design of the ship. We talked about those doors that can close off part of the hangar deck. Well, there are numerous features around these aircraft carriers that included this philosophy of damage control. We needed to have operational procedures, and we had specific people who were trained in damage control and repair of containing fires and repair of ships that were damaged. And it had proved its benefit through the war, because there was a lot of U.S. aircraft carriers and ships that were damaged and normally would have been sunk, and as part of the Imperial Japanese Navy were sunk, but we saved them and returned them to service. Let's talk a little bit about aircraft operations, and then we'll be finished up. We're going to talk about launching airplane. We don't take off in an airplane on board an aircraft carrier. You're launched. It's a very different experience. Navigation and communication is very different. And recovery. We don't land airplanes on board ships. They are recovered. And again, it's a very different experience. This is an example. Anybody want to guess the aircraft? This is an Avenger, and it is on board an aircraft carrier and is being hooked up to the launch gear, the shuttle on the launch gear, by bridles. So we don't use this system anymore because we have beefy nose gears that we can hook up into a shuttle. But we used this system probably into the 1960s, even with jets. But if you take a look closely, except maybe one of our Tiger Cats, I'm not sure, take a look closely at our carrier-based ships, carrier-based airplanes, Dauntless, Avenger, Corsair. You will see some very nice hooks up underneath the fuselage, and those hooks are there to hook up the bridles for the launching. A lot of our ships, or a lot of our airplanes were not launched by, there was enough natural wind across the deck. Our Essex-class carriers could do about 33 knots. A knot is 15% faster than a mile per hour. So it's about almost 40 miles an hour. And that natural wind across the deck would get them to the point where a Wildcat, a fighter, and the Dauntlesses could usually take off just in the 400 feet that was left on the deck. The Avengers, sometimes they could take off if their weight was low, but if they were carrying one of the big Mark 13 torpedoes, they usually were launched off the aircraft carrier. So takeoff and launching was dependent on how fast the ship was going, how much natural wind we had, and what the payload of the airplane was, and what the airplane was. Getting back to Mom, again, the theme of our naval aviators always referred to the ship as female, she was she, and sometimes referred to as Mom. And it was a very affectionate terminology because Mom was nurturing and a safe port to be coming to. So you need to go on out and try to find where the enemy was. And this was all over featureless water. So if you were going to go and navigate over land, you had some features like rivers and towns and mountains. Sometimes they were covered over by clouds, but when you're navigating over water, you got nothing to look at, so you need to do dead reckoning. Dead reckoning involves knowing where you were in terms of latitude and longitude. So as part of the pre-flight briefing, they would tell you specifically where you were in terms of latitude and longitude and where the ship would be 4 hours later when you came back. Because it wasn't going to be in the same place. You knew the airspeed of the airplane pretty accurately. You had a pretty good compass, so you knew your heading, magnetic, you could calculate the true. But you had to take a guess at what the wind speed was. So if you had a crosswind, it would drive you off your course. And the meteorologist would come down as part of the pre-operations briefing and kind of tell you what their guess was. But you needed to be able to read the sea conditions and guess where the winds were coming from. But they gave you a tool to help this, and that was a little desk. And the desk had a maneuvering board, which was nothing more than a circular depiction of headings and distances from the ship, and a small circular slide rule. It's called the E6B. And if there's any aviators, doesn't have to be military, but from a few decades ago, will probably know how to use an E6B. I know I sure do. And it is a little desk. It's made out of plywood, about 18 inches square, and fit underneath the instrument panel, so the pilot could do his dead reckoning and calculating where he's going to be. So in addition to flying the airplane, trying to stay out of the way of people trying to shoot you down, dropping your bomb, talking to your radio operator in the back seat, you also had to be navigating all the time. And you were invested in the outcome. Because at the end of the day, if you go back and you messed up your navigation, your dead reckoning, you're not going to come close to the ship. Here's a little picture. I think this is of a Dauntless, and this is this little desk that slides under the instrument panel, and the pilot was very busy doing this. We had a little help. As the war progressed, the Navy developed what's called a YEZB system. So it broadcasted a relatively weak radio signal, good to about 30 miles. Some people report getting it a lot further away, but it would send a coded designation that would help you understand where you were in a circle around the aircraft carrier that you're trying to get a hold of. Anybody pilots in the audience? It was kind of the first derivative of VORs. But pretty basic, but it worked relatively well, and a lot of people lived through the war and got back to the ship because of it. Relatively straightforward, different code for every 30 degrees around the compass rose. It was changed every day, so as part of the briefing, you would be given what those codes were for those various 30-degree segments, but you made sure you copied it down. And in the Dauntless, when you had a young enlisted sailor, one of the things he would ask, Mr. Smith, did you copy down the codes for the beacon? So yes, I did. Okay, so well, let's go. But it was very effective. Probably the most difficult thing, and the thing that defines naval aviators from pretty much almost any other pilot, is recovery. Getting the plane back on board the ship. And it's not magic, but it takes some practice, and it is an example of very precise flying. Let me do it back here. Airspeed is hugely important. Attitude of the airplane is hugely important. There's very, very limited visibility, and you're going to rely on a third party to help you bring the plane back on board. The dangerous thing about bringing a plane back on board is you are flying it right on the edge of a stall. So you want to be going as slow as you possibly can. So this is the cross-section of a wing flying through the air, lift, and the airflow around it is pretty decent. As you increase the angle of attack, you do get some increase in lift at lower speeds, but you start getting separation of the air as it goes over the airfoil. And then at a high angle of attack, pretty soon the air going over the top of the wing that generates the lift starts separating completely, and the airfoil stalls. So in most propeller-driven airplanes of World War II, that speed was about 69 to 70 miles an hour. So flying down the final approach, you were right on the edge of a stall. And as you came across the ramp and getting over where the wires are, you pull the power back, that propeller kind of ends up being a fairly decent brake, and the plane falls out of the air onto the deck. So you don't land the plane, you crash it into the deck in a controlled fashion. And it works pretty well, but it can be pretty scary to do. But it is an example of precision flying. This is an example of a Wildcat. You can tell by the gear it's a Wildcat. He's got his flaps out, and he is right on the edge of a stall. So the stick starts getting mushy, doesn't have a lot of grab in it, and you know the plane is going to stop flying any minute, and that's exactly what you want to do. So this plane will fall out of the sky here fairly shortly. Its hook will grab one of those wires, and you will have a successful recovery. Here's the flight deck we talked about before. So ideally, if you were out sitting on the front of the airplane, there's no seat out there, this is what the flight deck would look like. But that's what the flight deck, excuse my graphics, Bill, but it's the best I could come up with. That's what the pilot sees as he gets close to the deck. He can't see nada, okay? So that's what makes bringing airplanes back on board flight decks so dangerous. But he has some help, because right over here, he's not set up now because they're not really in flight operations. Right out here is a guy called the landing signal officer, known affectionately as Paddles. And this is a great example of the type of compliance we have with the appropriate uniform of the day. You're in the South Pacific, it's hot, man. You're going to be up on that deck, it's going to be breezy. You might as well get down to your skivvy shorts. But here is, I guess, Hellcat, you think? I'm not sure. So again, he's coming with, and this signal that the LSO has given him is the cut signal. So he's right on the edge of a stall. The power he's got in is keeping the plane flying, and as soon as he gets that cut signal, the pilot pulls the power back. That plane is going to stop flying, and it's going to fall straight down, nearly. But that is the way it's supposed to be done, and it's the only way you can successfully recover an airplane. So here's an example of an LSO who's more appropriately dressed. Gives you an idea. We didn't wear flight suits at those times. We were just kind of in our working uniforms. And he's got some enlisted helpers who are identifying where the planes are in the traffic circle, etc. One other function that the LSO does, he also grades each landing. And he has a relatively complex shorthand, and he dictates those grades to one of his enlisted recorders here. And then after flight operations, the LSO goes to each of the ready rooms and debriefs each of the landing pilots as to how well they did. And he does that regardless of rank or age or any other factor. It's brutally, brutally honest. And so usually the commanding officers of these squadrons were either senior lieutenant commanders or commanders, and they had, like most aviators, pretty sensitive little egos. And sometimes they would take exception to the LSO, who basically said it was a poor grade. Best grade you could get. This is part of his shorthand. Okay in parentheses. Okay is a perfect landing. Okay in parentheses was not so bad. And then at each point in the approach, he tells whether he was on speed, on elevation, on attitude, etc. LSOs were very, very important and very skilled people. There usually was an LSO for each of the squadrons, etc. Example of a couple of airplanes, and as you go and take a look at our carrier-based airplanes, you'll notice some things. We talked about the hooks that the bridles would connect to. One of the things that we do is the wings look kind of different because we want to make sure the wings are as effective as they can be. So here is a Helldiver and has the leading edge slats that help the airplane, the wing behave properly, and the aileron continue to be effective even at high angles of attack. Here's a Dauntless with, before we had slats, we had these slots in the wing. Again, at high angle of attack, would keep the air moving over the ailerons so they would be effective at slow speeds. Unlike our modern aircraft carriers that have angled decks, so when you mess up an approach, you can simply put the power in and go around. If you messed up one of these approaches, you had to be stopped by a barrier, and that's what these are. These are wire barriers, because a lot of the airplanes that come in before you, we don't have time enough to strike them below, so they are marshaled on the bow of the ship. So if you don't grab the wire, you're going to go into those airplanes and those people. So we set up these barriers, and it's never pretty. Planes get banged up. Most of the pilots can get banged up a little bit, but one of the first things you do when you're coming in, you make sure your seatbelts are all cinched down very tight. Anyway, that is the end of my story. Carriers are very important to the war. They're very, very different than operating on land. The operation on board aircraft carriers defines the design of the airplanes, and the airplanes, the carrier-based airplanes in our collection, the Dauntless, the Avenger, the Corsair, and the Sky Raider, you know, miss one? Oh, the F-3F, all reflect that sort of different mission.